Right.
But
And,
we will see.
And the whole thing is they still think.
Oh, I know.
All right, good evening, everybody. We're going to begin here shortly. Please ensure your cell phones are off or on silent. And council members, as you can tell, microphones are working again, so please ensure those are on too as well.
Oh, my.
They're not working.
They're turned up pretty loud too, so.
Okay.
Oh,
good.
so we can talk quietly.
No.
No. You just want everything.
We got to be able to hear. All right. Today is Monday, December 18th, 2023. It is 6:04 p.m. It is a regular legislative meeting for Barberton City Council. Call this meeting to order. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, followed by the invocation by myself. I pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for the goodness, your mercy, and your grace. Help us to carry these wonderful gifts into our own hearts and lives. May you continue to be the voice of reason for what's right. Watch over our military and first responders, and as always, remember the 22. Amen.
Amen.
Clerk, please call the roll.
President Greer.
Here.
Mr. Heidick.
Here.
Mrs. Thompson.
Here.
Mrs. Bailey.
Here.
Mrs. Angela.
Present.
Mr. Griffin.
Here.
Mr. Jaber.
Here.
Mrs. Coburn.
Present.
Mrs. Fromm.
Here.
I'm digging it. I got that.
Following suit.
Approval of minutes. Approval of the minutes of the regular legislative meeting held on Monday, December 11th, 2023. Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to approve the minutes of the regular legislative meeting from Monday, December 11th, 2023.
Thank you. Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mr. Heidick's motion to approve the minutes of the regular legislative meeting held on Monday, December 11th, 2023.
Thank you. It was moved by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Thompson to approve the minutes of the regular legislative meeting held on Monday, December 11th, 2023, as presented. Are there any remarks? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? All right, minutes are adopted. Finance report. Acceptance of the finance report, Finance Department report for the month of November 2023, as presented. Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the acceptance of the finance report for the month of November 2023 as presented.
Thank you. And Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second that motion on the finance report.
Thank you. It was moved by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to accept the financial report for the month of November 2023 as presented. Are there any remarks? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? The financial report is adopted. Petitions and claims.
We have none.
Thank you. Matters requested.
They have all been dispersed or will be.
Will be.
Because we didn't, because this is the last meeting for this year, and they will be dispersed to the new council members in their next packet.
Great, thank you. Yeah, if you didn't notice, there was no committee meetings this evening. Citizens addressing council. I just checked a minute ago, there were none. I did see one new person come in. Is there anybody wanting to address council? All right, there are none. We'll move right into first reading of ordinances and resolutions.
Ordinance number 160-2023, presented by Mrs. Angela. Title, enter into contract GPD Group. An ordinance authorizing the mayor to enter into contract with GPD Group Incorporated, GPD, for professional engineering services for the construction, administration, and inspection services for the South Van Buren project and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mrs. Angela.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. And Mrs. Bailey?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Angeloff's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Angeloff and second by Mrs. Bailey to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Angeloff?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Angeloff.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 160-2023.
Thank you. Mrs. Bailey?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Angeloff's motion on adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Angeloff and second by Mrs. Bailey to adopt ordinance number 160-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Angeloff?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 161-2023, presented by Mr. Heidick. Title: Authorized Payment, Ross McDowell. An ordinance authorizing the Director of Finance to pay an invoice to Ross McDowell in the amount of $7,975 and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second that motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and second by Mrs. Coburn to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Angeloff?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adopt ordinance 161-2023.
Thank you. Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second that motion on adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and second by Mrs. Coburn to adopt ordinance number 161-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Angeloff?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 162-2023, presented by Mr. Heidick. Title: 2024 Temporary Budget. An ordinance adopting a temporary budget for operating expenses for the city for the period beginning January 1st, 2024, and providing for the administration thereof and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second that motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and second by Mrs. Coburn to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Angeloff?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adopt ordinance 162-2023.
Thank you. And Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mr. Heidick's motion for adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and second by Mrs. Coburn to adopt ordinance number 162-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll for adoption.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Angeloff?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 163-2023, presented by Mr. Heidick. Title: Year-End Appropriation Amendments. An ordinance modifying appropriations within certain funds in order to cover the expenditures to the end of the fiscal year and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. And Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second that motion on suspension.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Frye?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adopt ordinance 163, 2023.
Thank you. Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I second that motion on adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to adopt ordinance number 163-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Frye?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Before I read Resolution 164, 2023, this resolution was voted on in the Planning, Annexation, and Codes Committee meeting and added to the agenda. The committee invoked Council Rule 702 to suspend Rule 302, the 10-day rule. Resolution number 164-2023, presented by Mrs. Thompson. Title: Amending Resolution number 2-2023. Various types of businesses moratorium, and ordinance amending Resolution 2-2023 by adding tobacco shops and cultivation, processing, and/or retail dispensing of marijuana to the list of uses prohibited by the moratorium and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule is required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mrs. Angela?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second the motion to suspend.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Thompson and seconded by Mrs. Angeloff to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Frye?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of Resolution number 164-2023.
Thank you. And Mrs. Angela?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second the motion to adopt Resolution 164-2023.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Thompson and seconded by Mrs. Angeloff to adopt resolution number 164-2023. Are there any remarks? Mr. Jaber.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll be abstaining from voting on this tonight. I do have a piece of property who is leased out right now as a dispensary, and I'll be abstaining tonight on this vote.
Thank you.
Thank
Is
you.
there any other remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Frye?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
And Mr. Jaber abstained.
Thank you. Motion for adoption carries.
This ends the first readings.
Second reading of ordinances and resolutions.
We have none.
Third reading of ordinances and resolutions.
We have none.
Appointments,
We have none.
miscellaneous and unfinished business. There's nothing down. Is there anything from department heads? Anything from the body? Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to acknowledge the counselors that will be leaving us. I want to thank all of you. You have served through the weird. When you were elected, did you ever think COVID would happen? Did you ever think we'd be overseeing something like the CARES Act, the ARPA funds, all the weirdest things, and you all have served honorably through it. So many projects, so many weird things, sitting down at the Y in card tables 6 feet away from each other to plexiglass right here that we can't see through reflections. You've put up with probably the weirdest time I've ever seen on council, and you did it with excellence, and I'm proud to have worked with all of you. Thank you.
Is there anything, any other? Mrs. Angela?
Are we allowed to speak now?
Absolutely.
outgoing council people, are we allowed to speak? Okay. And I'm going to make this short and sweet. I know nobody's going to believe it. I know I heard some chuckles, but I'm going to. I'm going to try because we want to get out of here before we start snowing again. All I can say is this is one of the best jobs I've ever had. All I've ever wanted to do is to talk to people and communicate with people. And serving my ward in this community, it's been rewarding, and I loved every minute of it. However, there were some challenges. And there was a lot of good, but there was some challenges, and I just kind of want to step on that a little bit. My first challenge came in my 2018, and I was in my first year, or first term, and, there was some things that was sent an email, and then it was in the Barberton Herald that I didn't take my oath, seriously enough and whatnot. And, but the people that knew me knew that I did take this seriously. And there was another thing where there was a cut and paste conversation, and it all ended up on social media saying that I hated my residents. Well, if you hated them, you wouldn't have ran for the ward that you were in. So, that was kind of goofy too. And let me get my thoughts here. See, I got to get going. And I couldn't understand why a group of people were just picking on me and doing this and doing this and doing this. And I'm thinking, I don't even know who they are. They can be sitting in front of me. I don't know who they are. What's going on? So a little bit of investigating, finding out that right away, you're looking at negativity. And so right away, come to find out, that particular person thought he was running against me in Ward 2, and he wasn't even in Ward 2. So that was kind of a little chuckle. And I don't want to forget about blasting on social media, calling all of us old ladies. Well, I don't feel old. I do look old, but I don't feel old, so it is what it is. And this is something that I have to laugh about, because it makes me feel like I was back in elementary school. And I don't think I went to school with anybody, one person in elementary school. But I had my seat changed 3 times in 4 years. I mean, that has to go down in the history books, because I don't think that's ever happened before. And the next thing I want to kind of touch on is the people I talk to. I always say I'm not a politician. Politicians, they like photo ops. They like making promises that they can't keep. They like pointing fingers. This is my opinion only. And they like making all kinds of postings on social media, and they're not positive. I've always considered myself, from day one when I got elected, as an elected official to educate the residents. So many residents don't understand why the administration, or why utilities, or why service department does this, and why don't you do it your way. I wish we could do everything that everybody wants us to do their way. But that's not how it happens. The best thing to say is that you talk to the people, maybe face to face on the telephone, and get their problems and try to bring their problems, or bring the administration to their doorstep, or have a meeting so everybody can educate each other. So you're not bad-mouthing why so-and-so's not doing this. It's because it can't be done. And the reason it can't be done is because of this. There's always a reason. There's certain things in life that we can control, and there's certain things in life that we can't control. And in closing, Mr. Heidick, when you get to the big house in Columbus, you can explain the difference between yes and no and yes on your pieces of legislation. And I bet you they'll understand it down there. And with that, I pass.
Thank you, Mrs. Angeloff. Is there any other comments from council? Mrs. Fry?
Thank you. First of all, I would just like to, I'll say the good first. This has been my favorite job that I've ever had, even though it had many, many challenges, because really it's negative, because from the first thing, the phone call, that's negative because there's a problem that needs to be solved. But on the on the good side, through my dealing with all these residents about all these various problems, I've met people that I would have never met otherwise. And I've been in Barberton my whole life, so I already know a lot of people. But I've met people throughout the neighborhood, and it seems that the people that you do the least for think the most of you. Like if you would take care of a trash problem, you're really, the best council person they've ever had. But to Mrs. Angeloff's point, there are some things that just cannot be taken care of, whether it is because of the ORC or because of how the process works or whatever. But I'm so glad that I did this. I wanted to do it my whole life, and I knew I couldn't do it when I had a full-time job and my kids at home and all of those responsibilities. So I waited until I was an old lady, and I thought I'll do it then. So I wrote down some of the problems that I have encountered over these last 12 years, and they are numerous. I've dealt with cats, dogs, property maintenance, naming bridges, replacing bridges that are washed out, squatters, flooding, potholes, curbs, striping of street, leaves, trash, abandoned homes, fracking, sinkholes, tall grass, chickens, parking lots, unlawful parking, speeding, canvassing for levies, contracts, labor contracts, budgets, emails, phone calls, visits to inspect complaints, bad neighbors, businesses at residential homes, septic systems. Anything and everything that you can imagine comes to your doorstep when you are a council person. And when the people call, this is a bit of advice, don't tell them that you can do something about it. Tell them that you will try to do something about it, because you might be making a promise that you cannot keep. So take down all the information, go to the departments, find out what can be done, and then handle the situation. And with that, I will pass for the last time.
Thank you, Mrs. Frye. Is there any other council members that would like to say something? Mrs. Thompson?
Thank you. I just wanted to say that 5 years ago, I was sitting in the front row near where Mr. Best is now, working for the good old Barberton Herald. And I met many of you then in your prior term serving. And I just wanted to thank Mrs. Frye, who's actually the first person who told me, you should run for council. You can replace me when I retire. And I never thought that I would be sitting up here, and I've learned so much from each and every one of you. And I just appreciate you and thank you for all that you've done.
Thank you.
That's all.
Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. Mrs. Coburn?
I'd just like to say that this has been one of the best jobs that I've ever had, minus the pay, of course.
Of course.
Because the pay is not why you do this job. I have greatly appreciated being there for my residents and being aware of what my ward needed. And I've really enjoyed meeting the people and working with the rest of council. And I started out when I was 18, getting the vote lowered to 18 so that some of you could vote. And just because I'm 72 doesn't mean it's over. So I would like to say thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Coburn.
And with that, I pass.
Anything else from council members?
Yeah, I will.
Mrs. Bailey?
So it was an honor being appointed for this seat. I know I've been here shorter than anyone on council. Within hours of being appointed, I have a pretty thick skin. I've been in the business world for quite some time, but social media is just a nasty place sometimes. And the first thing I read about myself was my age and that I was a woman, in a very, very negative fashion on a community page. And I remember calling Mr. Greer and being like, oh man, this is within 2 hours of being appointed. And I strive, not only in this position, just in life in general, to change the that thought of, I'm not saying it's from male or female, but I just think if you work hard and you lead with kindness and see everyone as a human being and not with a hidden agenda, or with just because someone is different than you, whether that be their political party, whether that be their race, their anything. I think if you lead with what's best for people as a human race or as a community, we will always come on top. So that's all I have.
Thank you, Mrs. Bailey. Any other council members? All right, well, I am going to say something, and as most of you guys pointed out, public service can be not rewarding and a thankless job, oftentimes. And with many things coming through council, back to back to back, you tend to lose sight of the positive impact and the progress for the city of Barberton that you've been part of until you sit down and you start reflecting, and the list keeps on going and going and going and going. And that's important to remember. For the record, one of the stories with Mrs. Angeloff, I was one of those people that posted. And I was naive, arrogant. But I will say that working with you guys has changed my tune, changed my way. We now ask how our families are doing, how was our vacations. You know, we talk outside of council at times, and that means a lot. And it shows a lot about you. It shows a lot about anybody that you work with, that you have to be flexible as a council person. And each one of you guys here now and ones leaving have devoted a piece of your life to better the city of Barberton. And your name will forever be in the archives next to all the other great names that you can think of in the city of Barberton. It'll be going in the same locker, the same safe, and it'll be the next layer of the foundation for the future. So just always remember that. Your legacy will always be here. And I just want to thank you again, each one of you guys, for your time, your commitment. Thank you to your family for going through this. I know families were drug in, always seem to be drug into politics sometimes. And I want to wish you the best for whatever is next. And I'm sure, hope, and I know in some cases, that I will see you, we will all see each one of you probably, most likely, on a committee or in the seats or making a phone call to the next council people or the administration to check in, maybe complain. It's your turn. You can do that now. And but I just want to wish you and your families the best for the next, and thank you for your commitment and dedication to the city of Barberton.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything from the administration? Did you want to say anything? Okay.
It's hard because you guys are the ones that put me here.
Aw.
But it has been an honor and a privilege, and I have been in government my entire life, that I can pick up a phone and there is not one of you that hasn't responded back to me immediately, answered a question, gave me a point of view, and my phone is still never going to change. Please call me with anything you need. It has been a privilege and an honor to be your clerk, and forever to be your friend.
Thank
And
you.
please
Thank
eat
you.
cupcakes.
All right.
Thank you.
Anything else from council members? All right. I do have to mention a few things. Next meeting will be January 2nd at 7:30 p.m. That is an organizational meeting, the swearing in of new council members, and all committees will be meeting that evening as well.
7:30 start time.
7:30 start time.
That's charter.
It's charter
Right.
rules. Yeah. Other than that, it's snowing outside. Be careful. Who knows if we'll get an inch? Maybe we'll get negative a couple inches or positive a foot. We never know. And hope everybody has a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. That's coming up. And I don't have anything else. So communication from the mayor.
Thank you, Mr. President. As you mentioned, Most of northeast Ohio is under a winter advisory. We saw it out the window today. You couldn't even see the lake at certain times, and other times it was clear as day. So this goes until 10 a.m. They're calling from anywhere from 2 to 7 inches, but as we know, that changes between here and the snow belt. So as the president said, just gonna be ready for everything. But be ready, and cognizant of when you're driving, please be safe. Be aware of those around you, whether it's other drivers, whether it's people walking on bicycles or what have you. It's still very dark out there as well. We continue to collect non-perishables for MAC and Salvation Army. We had our first pickup last week. Got another one this week. Donations again can be made at my office or at the Lake Yale YMCA. And that runs through the end of January. Board of Health meeting canceled for Wednesday, December 27th. Talking about the year in review, kind of, as we enter this new year, there's a lot that we have planned for the future and a lot that we are building off of from previous successes. I look forward to the future and continued improvements throughout the city. One item that will be coming up to City Council is a request to modify the property maintenance rules, which is being reviewed by our law director, but that'll come to council next year.
We need that.
To the council members, where this is your last meeting, I do thank you for your service and all the comments that were made tonight. It's not easy. Social media has made it more difficult. There is a lack of education of the process. And we hear from the state's office where they keep tabs on school boards and commissions and councils and trustee meetings. And a lot of people get in office on one singular issue, and everything else is kind of a blur. And it can't, right? There's making a great impact in people's lives, doing real work. So my hat goes off to you. It's been a pleasure serving with you and working with you. I told the new council members, you get out of it what you put into it, right? And so to be involved. So it's very, very important. So thank you for your service. And just lastly, happy holidays to everyone, and I hope everyone has a wonderful New Year. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Just real quick follow-up. We do have cupcakes after this. And with nothing else, do I have a motion to adjourn? Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adjourn.
Thank you. Mrs. Thompson?
Thank you. I will second Mr. Heidick's motion to adjourn.
Thank you. It was moved by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Thompson that we adjourn. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Didn't think so.